a Soviet dream that became a nightmare. A disaster officials tried to cover up, as a brave few battled to stop radiation spreading across the globe. Using top-secret Soviet documents and hearing from those who risked everything. This is the story of one of the world's worst nuclear accidents. It's been 8 days since Chernobyl's fourth nuclear reactor exploded. The core of the reactor is smoldering, releasing large amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Helicopters battle to stop this deadly radiation escaping from the molten core.
The temperatures, which we are led to believe were in excess of 2,000 Kelvin, would annihilate anything that came into that vicinity. So the way to use that is to think about how we can use the heat to melt a structure that would act as a neutron absorber.
A number of different things were tried. It was decided to dump a lot of sand on top of the reactor core.
Temperature and radiation levels are rising.
There was a need to think about other types of element to encase that fallout.
Lead and a rare element called boron are added to the sand. Up to 200 drops are made every day.
They were tasked with going what they call bombing runs, filling up sandbags and dropping them through quite a narrow hole in the roof onto the reactor below. It's incredibly dangerous work.
The entire time, the people in the helicopter were receiving quite a high dose of radioactivity.
The reactor is leaking radiation that's up to 10 times above a lethal dose. One of the pilots who flew over the disaster site is Soviet Captain Alexander Maruhin.
И о себе не думаешь, а думаешь о том, что какую пользу мы принесем. Завалено, но очень большая радиация шла с этого котла. Очень большая радиация. Хоть и вертолет весь был закрыт, но кабина грузовая открыта, потому что замерялась непосредственно фотографии, хотели сделать. Фильтрованные маски, которые на борту вертолета у меня были, они практически не давали результата никакого.
In total, 5,000 tons of materials are dropped onto the reactor. 9 days after the disaster, the temperature begins to fall, and the radiation leak suddenly drops by 99%. But by then, the radiation leak outside the plant is huge. Large areas of Ukraine are now highly radioactive. The Soviet government announced an ambitious cleanup operation. Thousands of people are drafted into Chernobyl from across the Soviet Union.
Most of those were young men, and they were given a job to do without really being told the full consequences of what they were undertaking.
They become known as liquidators.
Liquidators was a Russian term to describe the people who were engaged in the cleanup. Mostly soldiers and other military people, many of them conscripts, brought in to do the dirty work.
Ultimately, around 600,000 people were involved in this liquidation campaign.
This is a high-risk operation. Working in and around the disaster site, the liquidators risk being exposed to high levels of radiation.
Если замеры мы делали на Земле, то было 2,3 тысячи рентген. Тысячи рентген. Не миллирентген, а рентген.
2,000 Röntgen is 10,000 times higher than background radiation. And many liquidators, like Vladimir Kagan, are sent into areas like this with little or no safety equipment.
Вся защита была, это одежда. Белая, комбинезоны, носки и нижнее белье одеваешь. В конце смены ты опять это сделаешь. Снимаешь, одеваешь свою.
The liquidators were definitely inadequately equipped for the dangers that they were facing.
The rule really was that the job had to be done, and if there wasn't the safety equipment, then people simply weren't given it.
Many liquidators travel miles from Chernobyl. They move from village to village, searching for radiation hotspots.
The release of radiation from the Chernobyl disaster was so intense that anything that came into that vicinity would have been irradiated.
Many towns and villages were affected by radiation. Where a building was infected, it was sprayed with a decontaminant. It was a viscous liquid that caused any radiation to adhere to the side of the building. So the building itself became a kind of almost flypaper where irradiated material was stuck to it. In other places where the radiation levels were even higher, bulldozers were sent in and entire villages were completely flattened.
Abandoned homes are searched. Cars are collected. Anything registering high levels of radiation is removed and buried. Then, some liquidators are sent on a bleak search and destroy operation.
You needed to remove all the livestock and much of the wildlife as well, because it was radioactive.
They went into towns, villages, found animals, pet dogs, cats, and shot them. It was terrible, soul-destroying work.
As the cleanup operation continues, helicopter pilot Alexander Maruhin is recruited for a special mission.
Специальная карта, секретная она, правда, была. Но у меня на борту находились академики по ядерной энергии. Они замеры делали Земли, Земля нормально была, все. Земля наша получила большую грязь, радиацию.
Harmful levels of radiation are detected up to 19 miles from the disaster site. During one flight over this contaminated countryside, Alexander makes a surprise discovery.
Но, вернувшись в этот район, пролетая над поселками, наблюдаю, сидят у дома. Приземлившись прямо в огороде у дома, подхожу к сельчанам и спрашиваю: а почему вы здесь? А мы вернулись, мы вас не можем покинуть. Рядом коровы есть, и доют, и сами кушают, что там, не знаю, но мы питаемся.
Their cows are likely producing milk that's highly radioactive. In the aftermath of the disaster, over 100,000 people are taken to hospital for examination.
If radioactive iodine gets into the food chain, and particularly into milk, almost all of it goes to this small thyroid gland in our neck. And so they got really very, very high doses of radiation to their thyroid gland.
Across the vast radioactive landscape, many people fear that they've been poisoned.
They didn't know what physical damage they'd suffered, whether they had radiological symptoms, whether they were suffering more cancers than you would have expected. They feared it.
Soviet authorities face a dilemma. Chernobyl used to produce 10% of Ukraine's electricity, and that power is still needed. Despite the huge dangers involved, it's decided the 3 working reactors must be switched back on.
То есть никто не думал вообще среди персонала, что станция не будет жить, когда будем пускаться. Поэтому первая была задача навести порядок в радиационных делах, научиться работать в этих условиях, перестать рвать на себе рубашки и самое.
Before Chernobyl can begin producing power again, 2 things must happen. Highly radioactive material has to be disposed of, and the destroyed reactor must be enclosed.
This was easier said than done because nothing like this had ever happened before, and nobody had the experience of building a containment device to prevent further radiation escaping.
An ambitious plan is drawn up. A large metal structure will be built, called the sarcophagus.
It was essentially a series of flat-packed slabs of concrete and steel, built off-site, put together, moved into position around what was left of the reactor building, and then assembled. This turned out to be probably the world's largest prefabricated building.
Инженерные, опять же, простейшие решения. Принимали решения, делали, строили. При минимальных, кстати говоря, затратах ДОС. Его перекрытие и так далее практически стоят без единой там, связки болтами, гайками. Как бревна, из бревен собранный дом.
The walls of the sarcophagus are built, but next to the exposed reactor is a roof, covered in highly radioactive material. Before operators can go back to work, this has to be cleared.
They tried using robotic vehicles, automated vehicles, but it didn't work.
Essentially, the radioactivity fried the circuits of those robots, and they died.
It became very clear, very quickly, the only solution was to use humans to do this work. And in a grim piece of Soviet irony, they became known as biorobots.
Soldiers were sent up to clear off the debris from the roof, back into the reactor hall. They were incredibly brave because they faced something that was, to them, a terrible danger.
Radiation levels on the roof are extreme. Liquidators are given strict time limits. Within 90 seconds, they could receive an entire year's dose of radiation.
Most of the dose they got was you can't control with suits and respirators. There is an additional risk from inhalation of radioactivity. There's an additional risk if you get contamination on your body. They were getting an external gamma dose rate risk, which goes through any suit that you can imagine.
Nearly 4,000 people braved the roof to clear this deadly material.
These people were following orders and they had to do what they were being told to do.
Но то, что после каждой смены многие вырывали, это я видел сам, те, которые ходили.
The fear of suffering radiation sickness drove many to use unorthodox ways that they believed would protect them. Some drank vodka, others took even more dangerous and futile measures.
Потому что спирт нет-нет выдавали, не то, что выдавали, а получал я на летательный аппарат, спирт получал. Вот. Приходилось ребятам всем вечером перед сном раздавать. Может, поэтому и спаслись, кто употреблял спирт. Видно, промывало органы, все это промывалось.
Five months after the explosion, the roof's radioactive material has been cleared. The Chernobyl power plant's 3 working reactors can now be switched back on.
— 26 сентября 1977-го я включал его как оператор. А вот 1 октября я включал его уже как главный инженер.
The liquidators raise a flag to celebrate. But within 24 hours, disaster would strike again.
As the sarcophagus neared completion, a military helicopter was flying over the sarcophagus, pouring decontaminant into the reactor just as a final cleansing operation, as it were.
И все, и он упал прямо на наших глазах. Мы шли с обеда и это видели. Кран был настолько высокий, что вертолет зацепился лопастями за троса. Это просто катастрофа. Там все погибли. 2 человека или 1, я не знаю.
These 4 victims add to Chernobyl's death toll. And 6 months after the explosion, now over 18,000 people have been admitted to hospital. In late November, the sarcophagus is sealed.
They managed to put up the entire erection in around about 250 days, which is quite remarkable.
The radiation leak has finally been stopped. The world breathes a sigh of relief.
We're assured it's now completely safe to be here, just a few hundred yards away from reactor number 4. When the concrete entombment was finished, the level of radiation went down by several thousand-fold.
The summer of 1987. Chernobyl makes headlines once more. 12 miles from the disaster site, inside this building, a trial is taking place.
The trial became known as a so-called open trial in the closed zone because they conducted it in Chernobyl.
No one could admit that the system could fail because the system was everything. So the government can't accept that responsibility. It's got to be someone else's fault.
In the dock are 6 people, including Anatoly Dyatlov, who was in charge on the night of the disaster, Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin, and Chernobyl's plant director, Viktor Brukhanov.
Brukhanov knew quite well that sooner or later he would end in prison. That was part of the unwritten rules of the game. Within the Soviet managerial system, the director would be always kept responsible for what happened.
For many, the verdict in this trial is a foregone conclusion.
The authorities have made up their mind who was responsible, but there needed to be some form of public acceptance and show of trial and retribution.
As authorities prepare to pin the blame, secret KGB documents now reveal they knew these people weren't responsible. Chernobyl's style of reactor had major design flaws.
This document states that in 1987 there were 66 emergency shutdowns at nuclear power facilities across Ukraine, which seems to be really very high.
80% of these shutdowns are associated with design and process equipment. It tells me straight away that the design is arguably not fit for what its purpose would be.
Rather than admit Soviet design was at fault, witnesses are called to try and pin the blame on those on trial.
Меня вызвали, я из Москвы прилетел. Мне задали 2 или 3 вопроса. Когда понял, что я отвечаю не так, прекратили допрос свидетелей. Все, я улетел обратно.
The verdict is announced. All are found guilty of violating safety measures. Dyatlov, Brukhanov, and Fomin received the maximum sentence, 10 years hard labor.
Потому что надо было бы в другом случае сказать, что у нас плохая техника, что у нас провалена наука. Есть виновник, люди нарушили правила. Все, точка. Великолепная техника, великолепное оборудование.
Five years after the Chernobyl disaster, and its impact is still being felt. It has severely damaged the stability of the Soviet Union.
Chernobyl became a catalyst for the independence movements that had been growing, I think, quite slowly, but had been calling for more autonomy for the republics.
In Ukraine, the first issues related to Chernobyl, with the demand, tell us the truth about Chernobyl. Show us the map of the fallout. It's impossible to imagine Ukraine's road to independence without mobilization around Chernobyl.
Disillusioned with how the Chernobyl disaster has been handled, the Ukrainian people declare their independence. It's the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. But in the rush towards independence, the human cost of Chernobyl is forgotten. Many of the liquidators, those who cleared up the disaster, are suffering terribly.
И все, что мы получили доза радиации, ну, нам, конечно, об этом не говорили, но все равно мне дало все заднее место. После этого сделали операцию, и сейчас я инвалид первой группы.
Меня там обследовали много-много раз. У меня лично, я перенес операцию. Операцию рак толстого кишечника. Вовремя я обнаружил его.
The official death toll stands at just 31. But those who were at the disaster site tell a very different story.
Значит, умерли с моей бригады 5 человек из 8. Понимаете? Молодых причем.
Моих друзей, которые выполняли задачи, а выполняли все почти. И много померло, ребят. Очень много. Не знаю, кто живы или нет, с моего экипажа и всех, сколько я летчиков знал, уже многие ушли от нас. Очень много ушли.
even for those who didn't receive a fatal dose of radiation. There is still a huge price to pay.
People's fear of what might happen to them because of the radiation. That's been the biggest single problem in terms of health effects.
Убьет радиация и так далее. Психологически-то многие сломались. И он жил в ожидании, когда у него испортится здоровье, когда у него возникнет рак.
You think the radiation is going to do harm for you, so you don't take as good care of yourself as you might. You might drink more, you might smoke more, you might live more dangerously.
And so those factors in the lives of the liquidators have been much more important than the radiation dose that they received.
By the mid-90s, for those living in areas contaminated by high levels of radiation, there's a growing health crisis.
I started becoming interested in Chernobyl when my boss, who was one of the premier pathologists, came back from Belarus. He was visibly shaken.
We have seen an increase in thyroid cancer in about 7,000 children. Everyone was a child at the time of the accident.
We predict there'll be probably in excess of 16,000 thyroid cancer cases, but that will be spread over a long period of time, so over the next 50 years. Most of us were expecting to see far more different types of cancer from exposure to radiation. It is possible there may still be an increase, but we would have started to see something by now if it was going to be a big increase.
The exact number of deaths caused by the radiation will never be known, but the UN estimates it could be as high as 4,000. The city, just 2 miles from the disaster site, remains a haunted wasteland. Without human interference, nature is reclaiming the area. But at Chernobyl, there's a growing problem that threatens to raise radiation levels once more.
Inside the sarcophagus, it was essentially continually raining. It was because of the heat difference between the inside of the sarcophagus and the outside. So everything inside of the reactor building, inside of the sarcophagus, was corroding really very badly, including the fuel itself, which, when it corrodes, it creates radioactive dust.
The sarcophagus is falling apart.
A lot of it was built so that it was propped up, basically like a house of cards. It was really never built to last. Sooner or later, it was going to collapse.
Workers explore Reactor 4's building and discover corrosion in many areas. Recognizing the threat Chernobyl still poses, 45 countries, including the United States, Russia and the United Kingdom, all donate towards a new, safe confinement shelter.
The overall plan was something like 2.1 billion, and 1.5 billion of that was for the construction and design and construction of the new safe confinement.
Work finally starts on the new structure in 2010. But it takes another 6 years until it's ready to be placed over the old sarcophagus.
It was decided that the best solution was an arch that could be built some distance away with a relatively low levels of radiation exposure and then slid over the facility once it's completed.
This is to be the largest movable land-based structure ever built.
sliding something 3 times the weight of the Eiffel Tower with millimetric precision over several days. The longest slide we did in one day was about 18 meters, and it had to slide 300 meters. That gives you an idea of how long it took, and it was slide, stop, check, slide, stop, check at every time. As soon as we got to slide over the confinement, we had to interface with the old structures. We encountered tremendous challenges in terms of the radiological risk there. The worst was places where workers could work for about 5 minutes a day in terms of sealing the old structure because of the radiation levels were so high. At times had doubts whether we'd actually ever get over the finishing line.
The shelter is finally in position. As the new confinement structure is sealed into place, radiation levels fall by 90%.
The lifetime of the new safe confinement is 100 years. Its design life is 100 years. I have every expectation that it will actually last considerably longer than that.
Reactor 4 is now safer than it has ever been, and the teams start the long and difficult task of deactivating the remaining reactors. But 6 years on, the contained Chernobyl plant is about to face another catastrophe.
Once the invasion happened, people realized that the invasion route, one of them at least, towards the capital, Kiev, lay through the exclusion zone.
Russia was moving tanks and heavy equipment through the zone, and that raised radioactive dust.
Ukraine is under attack. It has been since the early hours of the morning.
Russia pouring troops and tanks into the Chernobyl exclusion zone.
At the end of February, Russia invades Ukraine. Around Chernobyl, the Ukrainian army prepares to fight. The spectre of another nuclear disaster strikes fear around the world.
Chernobyl is this word that is associated with such great horror, and the thought that that might suddenly not be safe was a huge cause for concern.
As Russia invades, Ukraine tries to establish Chernobyl and other nuclear power plants as no-go areas.
The Ukrainian authorities were begging the International Atomic Energy Agency to negotiate a deal in which there would be a 30-kilometer exclusion zone, the area that would be prohibited for any kind of military actions and any kind of military operations.
Their pleas fall on deaf ears. Without any agreement in place, Chernobyl and all the staff who work there remain a target.
There's still a lot of people working on the Chernobyl site. A lot of scientists that are needed, there's a lot of administrators that are needed, there's a lot of maintenance people that are needed. It's about 2,500 people that are there. They're going in and out on a daily basis.
The main task to the people working on the site is really just to make sure that the place stays as safe as it possibly can, checking the spent fuel, making sure that there's no damage to any of the containers and so on.
Within hours of the invasion, Russian and Ukrainian forces battle outside the nuclear power plant.
I think that really struck a deep chord and provoked deep fear that something might once again go wrong in Chernobyl.
The Chernobyl plant is now in the hands of the Russians.
It was actually reported that a shell had hit one of the containers housing the nuclear waste. And a spike was recorded in radiation levels.
In some areas, the indicators were showing that the radiation level went 10 times up. What happened was that Russia was moving tanks and heavy equipment through the zone, and that raised radioactive dust.
The rise in radiation levels is relatively low, but it's a frightening reminder of what could happen.
Any nuclear power plant is strategically important. There's the psychological impact of it, of being able to capture something that will hit the headlines. The Russians have now got control over this area where there was a disaster that happened. What's going to happen next?
Just 13 hours after the invasion begins, Russian forces take over Chernobyl. 200 workers are taken hostage.
The Russians then forced them to maintain and run the site, which was challenging because they can't really work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day.
However professional and however well-trained you are, if you're working under duress, or if you're working in difficult circumstances, or if you're not getting enough rest, there is a risk you may start to make mistakes.
I don't think the taking of the people hostage necessarily was the scary bit. If they kicked them all out or they killed them, then that would have been even more scary.
The workers are held hostage for the next 13 days. Then, the situation at Chernobyl worsens.
On the 9th of March, the power went down on the Chernobyl site. Now, that was significant because the power is needed to keep the air conditioning systems going inside the containment buildings where a lot of the spent nuclear fuel is being stored.
More than 30 years have gone into making this place safe, but if the systems they put in place are no longer able to function properly, then people would obviously be worried about the potential consequences.
The loss of power could lead to a radiation leak.
If the heat builds up, the water that's surrounding the spent nuclear fuel will begin to evaporate. And that evaporated water will pick up radiation and radioactive isotopes from the spent fuel rods and put them into the atmosphere in the containment area. It would increase the danger in the area and the danger of highly radioactive isotopes escaping into the atmosphere if that got vented.
Information leaks out that the Russian soldiers don't understand the danger the Chernobyl plant holds.
They won't have been briefed of the hazards in Chernobyl. In fact, there are reports to suggest that many of them had never even heard of the Chernobyl disaster.
With every passing day, there's a growing fear about what's happening inside the plant. Suddenly, all monitoring systems and all communications to the outside world are cut.
Once you cut off communication, you can hope that everything's okay, you know that there are systems there, but ultimately you do not know what's happening.
Communication is absolutely key. Once you lose your situational awareness, then one's mind starts to run riot. And when you're looking at a potential nuclear disaster, and there is no information going any way, people obviously start thinking about what the implications are. And because it's nuclear, one is looking at the worst case scenario.
After 5 days, Chernobyl is reconnected to the power grid.
When we realized that actually Chernobyl was back up and running, the power was running, people were there, the flow of information was happening, that was a huge relief.
The workers have been held hostage for 3 weeks. Conditions inside the plant are deteriorating.
It seems unlikely to me that that Chernobyl had 3 or 4 weeks of food already backed up. We know that the Russian army has got no food, so no doubt they were on meagre rations, with people holding guns over their head and not knowing what was happening tomorrow. I mean, absolutely horrific.
There are reports of people having to sleep on chairs or in their offices or whatever. This is not a place which is meant for people to stay there for days and days and days.
The hostages have now exceeded 15 days at the plant. The maximum time allowed to keep radiation exposure to safe levels.
If the war means that those levels have not been observed or adhered to, then there are potentially consequences for the people who are working at the site and may have had more exposure than they should have.
Word gets out that Russian soldiers digging trenches around Chernobyl could be falling sick.
They won't have understood the threats from the radiation. So they're sitting there breathing in the smoke with radioactive particles in it, the dust that their armoured vehicles and the wheeled vehicles are kicking up with radioactive isotopes in it, and not knowing that these are potentially causing them harm. They probably still don't know that these are causing them harm, and I suspect the Ukrainian scientists haven't told them.
Russian troops have now pulled out of the heavily contaminated Chernobyl nuclear site.
After 24 days of captivity, the hostages are finally released. And replacement workers are allowed to enter the site.
It was a relief, things were starting to get back to normal, but it's a reminder that in order for the safety procedures to function properly, people need to be allowed to go in and out, not kept there in circumstances which must have been at times terrifying.
The Russian targeting of Chernobyl has highlighted the potentially devastating role of nuclear installations in wartime.
The last time that we had a large-scale war in Europe was the Second World War. This was not a Europe where there were nuclear power stations. And I think the return of 20th century war, combined with this technology that was supposed to be part of a peaceful future, has really scared people.
Russia is really weaponizing nuclear power plants in this war on Ukraine. What is happening in Ukraine today is a warning to the world as a whole about the danger of the nuclear power that normally we didn't think about or didn't talk about, and that's what happens once the war arrives.
The unthinkable of attacking nuclear power stations has happened, and we must make sure that it doesn't happen in future.
Chernobyl's deadly legacy began over 30 years ago and will continue long into the future.
The Chernobyl reactors today are a stark reminder of what happens when you don't think things through, when you don't have a plan for what to do when something goes wrong. Particularly when we're talking about radioactive materials that could have severe health consequences. Those materials are now there. They may still be there for another 30 years, maybe 300 more years.
Today it symbolizes different things for different people. It has been a symbol of the danger that the nuclear power brings along, but also a symbol of the war and Russian aggression. So Chernobyl really means different things, but none of those things is actually good or positive.
With no distress signal or prior warning, it seemed to simply disappear. A Channel 5 original documentary, Flight MH370 The Vanishing, starts brand new Monday at 9. Paramedics race to help an elderly woman having fallen down the stairs the night before in ambulance code red, new next.